On April 29, 2004, the last car ever to carry the Oldsmobile name rolled off an assembly line in Lansing, Michigan. It was a dark cherry red Alero sedan. The workers who built it signed their names across its body, a farewell written in permanent marker on an automobile that had outlasted every expectation and finally run out of road. Walk into that Lansing plant on that final morning and you would have felt the weight of something ending. 107 years of American automotive history compressed into a single shift, a single car, a single quiet moment when the lines stopped and did not start again. The machines fell silent. The workers stood still. And then it was over. At its height, the Oldsmobile Factory in Lansing was one of the most productive assembly plants in all of North America. More than 14 million cars built within those walls alone. Across a workforce that at peak employed thousands of men and women, the plant ran around the clock, producing vehicles faster than the mind could easily picture. In 1985, the brand sold over 1,066,000 cars in a single year, a number only Ford and Chevrolet had ever matched. The Oldsmobile name was woven into the American experience. It appeared in a hit song in 1905. It appeared at the Indianapolis 500. It appeared in the driveways of the middle class from Maine to California, year after year, generation after generation, for more than a century. Then something went catastrophically wrong. By 1993, annual sales had collapsed to just 402,000 units, less than 40% of the peak just 8 years earlier. By the time General Motors finally announced the brand's closure in December of 2000, the oldest surviving American automobile manufacturer had been reduced to a question mark. So how does the first great car brand in American history, the company that invented the modern assembly line, the fully automatic transmission, the first satellite navigation system in a production vehicle, how does it simply disappear? The answer runs through a blacksmith's son from Geneva, Ohio, a factory fire that changed everything, a golden era of muscle and chrome, a scandal that shattered trust, and a series of decisions that turned an American icon into a ghost. This is the story of Oldsmobile, its rise, while its dominance, its fall. Welcome inside the Lansing factory, where 107 years of American ambition were born, celebrated, and quietly buried. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. This is one of the most remarkable stories in American industrial history, and we're just getting started. Let's go. June 3rd, 1864, Geneva, Ohio. Ransom Eli Olds entered the world in a small Ohio town, the son of a blacksmith and pattern maker named Pliny Fisk Olds. The household ran on iron and ingenuity. His father worked metal for a living, and the family breathed the rhythms of a machine shop from the time Ransom could walk. It was the kind of childhood that builds either resignation or obsession. Yet in Ransom Olds, it built obsession. When Ransom was still a boy, the family moved first to Cleveland, then, after a difficult stretch and a failed farming venture, settled finally in Lansing, Michigan in 1880. Pliny opened a new machine shop there, P.F. Olds & Son, and Ransom, still a teenager, dropped out of high school to work full-time in the family trade. He took a brief course at Bartlett's Business College in 1882 and 1883. Then returned to the metal and the machines. He became a partner in the firm by 1885. But Ransom Olds was not content to repair other people's engines. He was driven to build something entirely new. In 1887, he constructed his first steam-powered vehicle, a three-wheeled, self-propelled machine that could travel up to 18 miles on level ground. It was crude by any modern standard, but in 1887, it was extraordinary. He followed it with a four-wheeled steam car in 1893 and by 1896, he had built his first gasoline-powered automobile. On August 21, 1897, Ransom Eli Olds formally founded the Olds Motor Vehicle Company in Lansing, Michigan. He was 33 years old. The company was backed by a copper and lumber magnate named Samuel Lattice Smith, who purchased majority interest in 1899 and relocated the operation from Lansing to Detroit, renaming it Olds Motor Works. Smith became president. Olds became vice president and general manager. An arrangement that gave him the resources to build at scale? But planted the seeds of a conflict that would eventually drive him out of the company he created. What Olds understood with rare clarity was this: the automobile was not a luxury for the rich. It was a tool for the masses. And if you could build it cheaply enough, reliably enough, in large enough numbers, you could transform daily life for millions of people. He recognized something that most of his competitors had missed entirely. The real competition was not another car maker. The real competition was the horse. But here's the thing. Before Ransom Olds could prove his theory, fate intervened with fire, and the fire would change everything. March 9th, 1901. Detroit, Michigan. The Olds Motor Works factory stood on the corner of East Jefferson Avenue and MacArthur Bridge in Detroit. By early 1901, Ransom Olds had assembled 11 prototype vehicles, at least one powered by steam, one by electricity, and several by gasoline. He had not yet decided which design to put into mass production. He was testing, refining, preparing. Then the factory caught fire and burned to the ground. Everything inside was destroyed. Every prototype, every tool, every pattern and drawing and carefully assembled component, all of it gone. Everything except one vehicle. As the flames consumed the building, 2 workers wheeled a single prototype through the doors and out into safety. That prototype was a lightweight, open-carriage, gasoline-powered runabout with a distinctive curved front footboard that gave it its name, the Curved-Oldsmobile. Ransom Olds accepted the choice the fire had made for him. Yet he cleared the surviving foundry building and used it as a temporary assembly space. He reached out to suppliers. Henry M. Leland for engine production, the Dodge Brothers for transmissions, and others, to keep production moving while a new factory was built. Meanwhile, the Lansing Businessmen's Association made an offer too compelling to refuse. A 52-acre parcel on the south side of Lansing, the old Central Michigan Fairgrounds, given to Olds in exchange for bringing his manufacturing home. Production of the Curved Dash began in earnest in 1901. The car weighed 650 pounds and sold for $650. Olds built 425 of them that year, so an astonishing number for an era when most manufacturers were struggling to complete 20 or 30 cars annually. Managed to achieve that volume, Olds developed something that the world had never seen before, a progressive assembly line. The chassis sat on a wheeled castered stand and was manually moved from station to station, with each worker performing a single specialized task before the car rolled forward to the next. It was not the continuously moving assembly line that Henry Ford would patent 12 years later, but it was the direct conceptual ancestor of it. Ford himself visited the Olds factory to study the method before developing his own version at Highland Park in 1913. The Curved Dash exploded in popularity. Output jumped from 425 in 1901 to 2,500 in 1902. By 1904, the factory was producing 5,000 units annually. The Curved Dash became America's best-selling automobile, commanding nearly 40% of the domestic car market. It was sold across the United States and shipped to customers in Europe, Asia, and Australia. Then something happened that nobody expected. The man who built all of this was forced out of his own company. 1904, Lansing, Michigan. The tension between Ransom Olds and Samuel Smith had been building for years. Smith's son, Frederick L. Smith, who served as sales manager, had grown increasingly critical of Olds and his production methods. He demanded that Olds personally certify that each car leaving the factory was free from defects. Then, without Olds's knowledge or consent, Frederick Smith set up a separate experimental engineering shop. A direct challenge to Olds's authority within his own company. As the conflict became irreconcilable. In 1904, at the peak of the curved dash's popularity, Ransom Eli Olds severed all ties with Olds Motor Works and walked away. He was 40 years old and far from finished. Later that same year, Olds founded the REO Motor Car Company in Lansing, a name built from his own initials, Ransom Eli Olds. REO would go on to produce automobiles until 1936 and trucks until 1975. But his original creation, the company he had built from a blacksmith's machine shop in a fire-cleared lot, continued without him. Without its founder, Olds Motor Works moved production back to Lansing and continued under the direction of Frederick Smith. The company gradually shifted toward larger, more expensive vehicles, drifting away from the affordable mass-market philosophy that had made the curved dash a national phenomenon. On November 12, 1908, General Motors, then newly formed by William C. Durant, purchased Olds Motor Works, making it the second brand absorbed by the growing GM empire after Buick. Within GM, the brand was repositioned in the middle of a five-tier hierarchy, above Chevrolet and Pontiac, below Buick and Cadillac. The company's name was officially changed to the Oldsmobile division of General Motors on January 1, 1942. This corporate architecture gave Oldsmobile something powerful, a built-in market. Families who started with Chevrolet could aspire upward, with Oldsmobile representing the next rung on the ladder of American success. Millions of Americans did exactly that. Through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Oldsmobile continued to innovate. In 1926, it became the first automobile manufacturer to use chrome plating on exterior trim. In 1932, it introduced the first automatic choke. In 1935, Oldsmobile, along with other GM divisions, offered the first all-steel roof on a production automobile. And in 1940, it introduced the Hydramatic, the world's first fully automatic transmission available in a mass-market vehicle. The Hydramatic changed everything. No clutch pedal, 4 forward speeds. The driver simply pressed the accelerator. It was the future, and for the first time in decades, it was made in Lansing. The question was, what would come next? 1949, Lansing, Michigan. The post-war American economy was roaring. The veterans were buying homes, starting families, and purchasing automobiles at a rate that would have seemed impossible just 5 years earlier. The country was hungry for power, for speed, for something that felt like the future. Oldsmobile gave it to them. For the 1949 model year, Oldsmobile engineers introduced an engine that redefined what an American car could do. They called it the Rocket. It was a high-compression, overhead valve V8, the first of its kind offered in a mainstream production automobile. Where the old flathead engines of the pre-war era produced modest horsepower through sheer displacement, the Rocket 5.8 used overhead valves to breathe more efficiently, producing dramatically more power from the same amount of fuel. It set a new standard for the industry. Every serious automaker in America would spend the next decade scrambling to match it. The Rocket transformed Oldsmobile's identity overnight. In the 1950s, Oldsmobile cars were considered the fastest vehicles on the market. Their styling followed the engine's personality. Wide, aggressive grills that suggested jet propulsion, fins that swept back like rocket exhaust, badges shaped like launch pads and orbital rings. The space race was years away in political terms, but Oldsmobile had already claimed the cosmos as its marketing territory. Across America, the brand became synonymous with performance, with aspiration, with the particular American belief that speed and technology were evidence of progress. The cultural penetration was total. A 1951 song by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, widely considered among the earliest rock and roll recordings ever made, was titled Rocket 88, named directly for the Oldsmobile model. The song immortalized the car in the same breath that it helped define a new genre of music. No other automobile of that era achieved that kind of cultural resonance. In the early 1960s, Oldsmobile continued to push engineering boundaries. In 1962, the division produced the world's first turbocharged production car, the F-85 Jetfire, which also became the first production vehicle to use water injection. In 1966, the Toronado arrived, the first mass-produced American car with front-wheel drive since the Accord of the 1930s. Motor Trend named it Car of the Year. But the Toronado was later the first American car to offer a driver-side airbag in 1974. The first production vehicle with an onboard microprocessor controlling engine functions. The first American car with a built-in satellite navigation system, the GuideStar, in 1995. Innovation after innovation, decade after decade. The Lansing factory was running at full capacity, and the world was watching. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We're just reaching the peak of the Oldsmobile story, and the most dramatic chapter is still ahead. 1976, Lansing, Michigan. The number seemed impossible, 500,000 Cutlasses in a single year. In a country of 220 million people, Oldsmobile had managed to sell one variation of one automobile model to roughly 1 in every 440 Americans. And those buyers came back year after year to do it again. The Oldsmobile Cutlass had been introduced in 1961 as a trim package on the compact F-85. By 1965, it had become its own standalone model. By 1976, it had become something unprecedented, the best-selling car in the United States. Not the best-selling midsize car, not the best-selling GM product, the best-selling car in America, period. Outselling every Ford, every Chevrolet, every import that had begun to trickle in from Japan and Germany. That year, over 500,000 Cutlasses were sold. And 56% of every Oldsmobile produced carried the Cutlass badge. The Cutlass Supreme two-door coupe alone, one trim level of one model, sold more than 186,000 copies. That is roughly 510 cars sold every single day of 1976. The achievement placed Oldsmobile in historically exclusive company. It became the only American automobile manufacturer outside of Ford and Chevrolet ever to break 1 million total units sold in a single model year. By the mid-1970s, Oldsmobile had displaced Pontiac and Plymouth to become the third best-selling brand in the entire United States. In 1985, Oldsmobile set its all-time production record, 1,066,122 vehicles in a single year, a number that Ford and Chevrolet alone had achieved before. The Cutlass's appeal defied easy explanation. It was not the fastest car on the market, nor the cheapest. It was not radical in design or revolutionary in engineering. But it occupied a precise and powerful position in the American automotive imagination. More premium than a Chevrolet, more accessible than a Buick, wide enough and smooth enough and comfortable enough to satisfy a generation of buyers who wanted exactly that combination. The Cutlass Brougham, with its crushed velour interior and padded vinyl roof, spoke to the suburban American dream in a language that millions of families understood immediately. Meanwhile, something else was happening beneath the surface of that triumph. The very popularity that made Oldsmobile the third largest car brand in America was about to create a problem so serious that no executive at General Motors seemed to fully appreciate it. until a Chicago mechanic opened an engine compartment and found something that was not supposed to be there. March 1977, Chicago, Illinois. A man named Joseph Seeweck had purchased a brand new 1977 Oldsmobile Delta 88. He was proud of that car. He had paid for an Oldsmobile, which meant, in his understanding, that he had paid for the famed Rocket V8 engine, the engine that had defined the brand since 1949, the engine that had been immortalized in a rock and roll song, the engine around which Oldsmobile had built its entire identity for nearly 3 decades. Well, when Seeweck took his Delta 88 to a mechanic for service, the mechanic noticed something wrong. The parts that should have fit the Oldsmobile Rocket 5.8 did not fit the engine under the hood. That was because the engine under the hood was not an Oldsmobile engine at all. It was a Chevrolet 350 V8. Seeweck filed a consumer complaint, and the story swept across the national press within days. The revelation was explosive. In 1977, Oldsmobile's production had topped 1 million units for the first time. The demand for the Rocket 5.8 had exceeded the Lansing engine plant's capacity to produce it. So General Motors had quietly substituted the Chevrolet 350 V8 in more than half of all 1977 Delta 88 models, without disclosing the switch in advertising materials or sales brochures. To make the substitution less visible, GM had begun painting all of its engines in a uniform corporate blue, masking the traditional identifying colors that would have distinguished an Oldsmobile power plant from a Chevrolet one. Within months, approximately 250 lawsuits had been filed by state attorneys general and private litigants across the country. The case was consolidated in a federal court in Chicago. Attorneys dubbed the affected vehicles Chevymobiles. On June 28, 1981, meeting of a federal jury ruled that 14,000 owners who had purchased Chevrolet-engined Oldsmobiles before April 10, 1977, were each entitled to $550 in compensation. The total jury award came to $7.7 million. The financial cost to GM was ultimately calculated at approximately $8.2 million across all settlements. In terms of a company that sold over 1 million cars per year, that figure was a rounding error. The reputational damage was something else entirely. For decades, General Motors had trained its customers to believe that an Oldsmobile engine was categorically different from, and better than, a Chevrolet engine. The Rocket V8 was not merely a marketing slogan, it was a promise, and GM had broken it. Yet the problem was that this was only the beginning of Oldsmobile's troubles with trust. And the next disaster would strike from an entirely different direction. 1978, Lansing, Michigan. The oil crisis had changed everything. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 had sent gasoline prices into shock and forced American automakers to reckon for the first time with fuel efficiency. General Motors believed it had found a solution. A diesel engine derived directly from the Oldsmobile gasoline 5.8 block. The concept was straightforward. Diesel fuel was cheaper than gasoline, diesel engines were more fuel efficient, and the conversion from gasoline to diesel could be accomplished without entirely new tooling, saving hundreds of millions in development costs. What GM engineers failed to adequately address was that the modifications necessary to make a diesel engine actually work were far more demanding than the simple block conversion suggested. The head bolts used in the converted diesel engine were the same design as those in the gasoline version. An error of catastrophic proportion, because diesel combustion creates dramatically higher pressure than gasoline ignition. Under that pressure, the head bolts would fail. Water-infiltrated fuel injectors. Fuel lines clogged with paraffin in cold weather. Oil galleys in the cylinder heads proved undersized for diesel lubrication demands. One engineer who recognized these problems before production was reportedly sidelined. The Oldsmobile 5.7-liter diesel 5.8 was offered beginning in the 1978 model year on the Custom Cruiser, the Delta 88, and the 98. It was quickly spread to other GM vehicles, Buick Cadillac, Chevrolet, GMC, and Pontiac all offered versions. Within months, dealerships were flooded with warranty claims. Engine failures multiplied. Repair delays mounted. The mechanical problems were so pervasive that it is estimated up to a quarter of all GM vehicles equipped with the diesel V8 suffered from serious mechanical failures. General Motors spent millions of dollars settling the resulting lawsuits and compensating affected owners. The diesel was finally discontinued in 1985. But the damage to consumer trust, particularly among exactly the kind of affluent, equality-conscious buyers that Oldsmobile had been cultivating, was profound and lasting. Buyers who had paid premium prices for a vehicle marketed on promises of efficiency and reliability had been burned twice in 2 years, once by the Chevymobile engine scandal, and again by a failed technology that GM had rushed to market without adequate testing. Across the country, a specific kind of buyer, educated, upwardly mobile, accustomed to being treated as a discriminating consumer, began looking at Toyota, at Honda, at the emerging Japanese brands that had turned reliability into a competitive weapon and were now beginning to move up market. They were building something in Japan that Oldsmobile had no answer for, and nobody in Lansing seemed to understand what was coming. 1984, Detroit, Michigan. From the outside, the numbers still looked impressive. Oldsmobile was selling over 1 million cars a year. The brand ranked third in total U.S. automobile sales. In 1984, General Motors reorganized its operations, consolidating Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac into a combined division known as the Buick-Oldsmobile Cadillac Group, a reorganization that would prove to have unintended consequences that no executive seemed to fully anticipate at the time. The reorganization deepened a practice that had been growing throughout the 1970s, badge engineering. Under this approach, vehicles from different GM divisions were built on identical or nearly identical platforms, differentiated primarily by exterior styling details, interior trim, and nameplate. But the logic was sound from a manufacturing cost perspective. Shared platforms meant shared tooling, shared development costs, and greater production efficiency. The problem was that it was destroying the identity of every brand involved. By the mid-1980s, an Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra and a Chevrolet Celebrity shared the same A-body platform. The Oldsmobile Calais and the Pontiac Grand Am were platform twins. The Oldsmobile 98 and the Buick Electra were nearly indistinguishable to the average buyer. A critic reviewing an era of GM styling coined the term Oldsmo Buick, a word that captured the bland interchangeability that had crept across the entire GM lineup. It appeared in a 1985 Chevy Chase film called Fletch and immediately entered the popular vocabulary. The specific irony was this: the record sales years of 1983 through 1986 had been achieved partly because Oldsmobile was charging prices only marginally higher than Chevrolet for vehicles that cost little more to produce than a Chevrolet. The price premium had collapsed because the product differentiation had collapsed. Buyers who might previously have aspired to an Oldsmobile because it was genuinely different from a Chevrolet were now finding that it was barely different at all, and paying for a name rather than an experience. Then came 1986. Then came the advertising campaign that, in the estimation of many analysts, administered the killing blow to the brand's identity. The problem was not simply that the campaign was tone-deaf. Yet the problem was that it attacked the single greatest asset Oldsmobile possessed, the loyalty of people whose parents had owned one. And once that loyalty was gone, it would not come back. 1988, New York City. The advertising agency had a pitch. General Motors had a problem. Oldsmobile's core buyer was aging. Industry research was showing that the typical Oldsmobile purchaser was older than the typical buyer for competing brands. The cars were perceived as vehicles for people who were settled in life, reliable, comfortable, familiar. The marketing team decided this was the crisis to solve. The campaign they developed was built around a single slogan: "Not your father's Oldsmobile." The concept was simple. Instead of traditional automotive advertising featuring the cars themselves, GM produced a series of television commercials pairing the children of celebrities with the parent who had made them famous. Winona Judd alongside Naomi, Lisa Marie Presley beside a photograph of Elvis, the children of Harry Belafonte, Roger Moore, Leonard Nimoy, William Shatner, and Ringo Starr, each standing next to an Oldsmobile and insisting that this was a new generation of car for a new generation of buyer. The campaign became one of the most discussed and most debated advertising efforts in automotive history. Within the industry, some saw it as bold and necessary. But among the consumers who actually bought Oldsmobiles, the response was something closer to shock. The message, as loyal customers understood it, was unambiguous. If you are the kind of person who drove your father's Oldsmobile, we no longer want your business. You go elsewhere. The result was immediate and measurable. Oldsmobile sales, which had exceeded 1 million units in 1986, fell to just over 500,000 by 1991. Half the buyers. Gone. In 5 years. The pivot point aligned precisely with the launch of the campaign. Meanwhile, the broader American automotive landscape was shifting in ways that compounded every one of Oldsmobile's existing weaknesses. In 1989, Lexus arrived. In 1989, Infiniti arrived. These were Japanese brands targeting the exact market segment that Oldsmobile had historically occupied, premium quality at a realistic price, but bringing with them a reputation for reliability and refinement that GM's badge engineering era had rendered Oldsmobile incapable of matching. By 1993, annual sales had cratered to 402,000 units. The oldest surviving American automobile brand was losing its customers to brands that had not existed a decade earlier. And by 1993, some analysts were already saying out loud what General Motors was refusing to acknowledge privately. The problem might be insurmountable. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything and helps us keep making videos like this. The final act of the Oldsmobile story is where it gets truly devastating. 1995, Lansing, Michigan. General Motors made one final serious attempt to save Oldsmobile. The vehicle they chose to lead the charge was unlike anything the division had produced in years. The Aurora was clean, aerodynamic, and genuinely distinctive, a full-size luxury sedan with a dual overhead cam V8 engine developed entirely within Oldsmobile and shared with no other GM division. Its lines were smooth and assertive without the overwrought chrome ornamentation that had characterized so many GM products of the 80s. Critics praised it. Automotive journalists called it a genuine statement of intent. GM was explicit about what the Aurora represented. The company repositioned Oldsmobile as an upscale import fighter, a brand meant to compete directly with Lexus, Infiniti, and Acura for buyers who wanted American design and American engineering at a price below the European luxury tier. The Aurora became the visual and philosophical template for every Oldsmobile that followed. Old model names: the 98, the Sierra, the Toronado, the Custom Cruiser, were retired one by one as the division rebuilt its lineup around the Aurora's design language. In 1995, the same year the Aurora arrived, Oldsmobile introduced the GuideStar on the 88, the first satellite navigation system available in any production vehicle sold in the United States, the brand that had invented the automatic transmission, the brand that had introduced the first turbocharged production car, the brand that had pioneered front-wheel drive, still innovating, still reaching. But the numbers told a different story. The Aurora sold well for a brief period, generating genuine enthusiasm, yet it could not offset the accumulated weight of a decade of brand erosion. Dealers were confused about who their customer was. Yet advertising budgets were being spread across too many overlapping models in too many overlapping segments. Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Cadillac, Saturn, and GMC were all competing for pieces of the same market that Oldsmobile was trying to claim. In December of 2000, GM's chief executive Rick Wagner stood before cameras and delivered the announcement. Despite what he called serious efforts to find profitable ways to strengthen Oldsmobile's product line, the company simply could not chart a viable path forward. The brand would be phased out. Production of new models would end between 2000 and 2004. Wagner's statement was measured and corporate. The workers in Lansing heard something different. They heard the sound of a century ending, and the Aurora. Beautiful, promising. It arriving too late became the last great Oldsmobile nobody remembered. January 2001, Lansing, Michigan. The phase-out proceeded on a precise schedule that had the quality of a countdown. In February of 2001, the final new Oldsmobile model, the redesigned 2002 Bravada SUV, arrived in dealerships. The Bravada, a mid-size premium sport utility vehicle introduced in 1991 and redesigned twice since, became the last new vehicle the brand would ever offer. It was also, in a piece of timing that felt either ironic or fitting, the first truck ever to pace the Indianapolis 500, completing that distinction just as the brand was being wound down. In June of 2002, production ended for the Intrigue and the Aurora F6 sedan. In March of 2003, then the Aurora 5.8 came to the end of its run. January of 2004 brought the end of Bravada production. March of 2004 ended the Silhouette minivan's long run, and then, in April of 2004, came the final chapter. The last 500 Aleros, Auroras, Bravadas, Silhouettes, and Intrigues produced were designated the final 500. They were painted in a single color, dark cherry metallic, and received special heritage emblems acknowledging the brand's history. Workers built them with the same hands that had been building Oldsmobiles for generations in Lansing. For some of those workers, the connection ran deeper than a single career. The Lansing car assembly plant had been, at its core, the Oldsmobile Factory for more than a century. It was the longest operating automobile factory in the entire United States when it finally closed its doors on May 6, 2005, 1 year after the last car came off the line. The very last Oldsmobile ever produced was a dark cherry red Alero GLS 4-door sedan. It came down the assembly line on April 29, 2004. When the car reached the end of the line, the workers who had built it signed their names to the bodywork with permanent markers, a tradition that had grown organically, without instruction from management, because the people who built the car understood that they were not just finishing a vehicle. They were finishing something that had begun 107 years earlier in a machine shop in Lansing, Michigan, in the hands of a blacksmith's son from Geneva, Ohio. Who had believed that the automobile would transform the world? That last Alero was driven to the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in Lansing. It went on display there. It remained until General Motors declared bankruptcy in 2009. At which point GM reclaimed the car and moved it to the GM Heritage Center in Sterling Heights, Michigan. Later, in December of 2017, the car was auctioned at a dealer-only auction and sold for $42,000 to a dealer in Florida. The oldest surviving American car brand had become a collector's item. 2006, Lansing, Michigan. There is a building at 920 Townsend Avenue in Lansing that tells the story of Oldsmobile's end in the language of architecture and silence. It's the Oldsmobile Administration Building, known internally as Building 70, was completed in 1966 to house the division's major administrative departments. It is 200,000 square feet of mid-century modern construction, exterior marble, glass curtain walls, and a design that recalled the General Motors Technical Center in Warren. Two interconnected towers rise from the northeast corner. A 6-level north wing and a 4-level south wing. The lobby once featured a sunken waiting area and a small reflecting pool. At its peak, the building housed approximately 900 employees. Its walkways contained snow-melting units buried beneath the surface. Two monumental sculptures by noted artist Samuel Cashwan, who had served on GM's own styling staff, stood at the entrance and in the lobby. One, as entitled Open Cage, once greeted every visitor at the main doors. By 1996, as Oldsmobile's decline accelerated, and the brand's administrative operations were consolidated with the broader GM organization. The division's remaining employees relocated to the Renaissance Center in Detroit. The Oldsmobile administration building was vacated. And then, it stayed empty. Today, the building sits abandoned behind a chain-link fence. The towers, which once contained the offices of the executives who decided the fates of millions of American automobiles, have been used as makeshift billboard space. For a period, they carried advertisements for the Cadillac ATS. At the time of writing, they carry a sign for the Cadillac CTS, a vehicle that has itself since been discontinued. The building that once housed the pride of the Oldsmobile division is now a canvas for the advertisements of a brand that outlasted it. The open cage sculpture was donated to the R.E. Olds Transportation Museum in 2006. The Oldsmobile lettering that had stretched across the penthouse's east wall, letter by letter in polished steel, was removed the same year and also donated to the museum. The main factory, the Lansing car assembly plant that had operated continuously since 1901, was demolished beginning in the spring of 2006. Demolition was complete by 2007, where the curved dash had first been assembled, where the rocket V8 had been born, where more than 14 million automobiles had been constructed over more than a century. The site is now largely cleared. A newer plant, the Lansing Grand River Assembly, operates nearby, building Chevrolets and Cadillacs on land that once formed the edge of the old Olds Motor Works campus. The one thing that cannot be demolished is the record. 107 years, 35 million vehicles, 14 million of them built in Lansing. 2004, America. The collapse of Oldsmobile was not a single catastrophe. It was a sequence. Each failure amplifying the next, each missed opportunity, narrowing the options available for recovery, until the accumulated weight of decades of decisions left no viable path forward. The first failure was the Chevymobile scandal of 1977. Yet that episode did something that no single product failure could have accomplished alone. It undermined the specific promise that Oldsmobile had been making to its customers for 30 years. The Rocket 5.8 was not just an engine, it was a covenant between the brand and the buyer. When General Motors broke that covenant quietly and hoped no one would notice, it told its most loyal customers something they would not forget. The second failure was the diesel engine disaster of 1978 through 1985. Coming within a year of the Chevymobile revelation, the failed diesel program burned a second group of buyers, particularly the educated, affluent, quality-conscious consumers who had been the foundation of Oldsmobile's market position. Most these were precisely the buyers who were simultaneously being courted by Japanese manufacturers who had made reliability their entire competitive identity. The third failure was badge engineering. Through the 1980s, as Oldsmobile's models became progressively more indistinguishable from their Chevrolet, Pontiac, and Buick counterparts, the brand lost the specific reason for its existence within the GM lineup. If a buyer could not articulate why an Oldsmobile was different from a Buick, there was no reason to pay the Oldsmobile price. The fourth failure was the Not Your Father's Oldsmobile campaign of 1988. In attempting to attract younger buyers, GM explicitly rejected the loyalty of the customers who were actually buying the cars. The largest market for Oldsmobiles was, in fact, It composed of people whose parents had owned Oldsmobiles. The campaign told those buyers, publicly on national television, that the brand they had grown up trusting was embarrassed by their association with it. The fifth failure was the truck market. Through the 1990s, the American automotive market transformed dramatically. By 2000, light trucks and SUVs accounted for more than 55% of vehicle sales. Oldsmobile never established a meaningful presence in that category. The Bravada was a modest entry. It was too little, too late. The Aurora, the Intrigue, the Alero, all were genuinely competitive vehicles. They arrived after the damage was done. They were recommendations on the resume of a brand that had already been dismissed. Stand outside the chain-link fence at 920 Townsend Avenue in Lansing today and look at the abandoned Oldsmobile administration building. The marble is still there. The towers are still there. The sign now advertising a Cadillac that has also been discontinued still hangs against the glass curtain wall, where 60 years ago, 900 people worked every day to sell America's most successful automobile. If you look carefully at the fence line, you might find a small trace of the lettering that once spelled out the brand's name across the penthouse. But you would have to look hard. What the story of Oldsmobile teaches us reaches far beyond the automobile industry, and it teaches it in ways that remain urgently relevant to every business operating today. The first lesson is about the cost of breaking trust. Oldsmobile spent 3 decades building a specific promise around the Rocket 8 engine. When General Motors violated that promise in 1977, quietly, without disclosure, and without apparent recognition of what the engine meant to its buyers, it damaged something that no settlement check could repair. Trust, once broken, does not simply wait to be rebuilt. It walks out the door and finds a competitor who has not yet broken it. The second lesson is about the danger of self-cannibalization. GM built the greatest automobile empire in history by creating a hierarchy of distinct brands, each with its own identity, its own customer, its own reason to exist. When badge engineering eroded those distinctions through the 1980s, GM did not save money. It destroyed the logic of its own hierarchy. The Oldsmobile buyer who could not articulate the difference between an Oldsmobile and a Buick was not going to spend extra money to find out. That buyer went to Lexus instead. The third lesson is about the danger of rejecting the customer you have. The Not Your Father's Oldsmobile campaign is studied in business schools as one of the most instructive marketing failures in American history. A brand's existing loyal customers are not an obstacle to growth. They are the foundation without which growth is impossible. When you tell your most loyal buyers that their loyalty is an embarrassment, you do not attract new buyers. You simply lose the old ones. Between 1985 and 2004, Oldsmobile went from selling 1,066,000 cars annually to building its last vehicle. 107 years of continuous operation, 35 million vehicles produced, 14 million of them built in Lansing alone. What is left? A signed Alero in a heritage center in Michigan, a museum bearing the founder's name, an abandoned building draped in someone else's advertisement, and the memory, among those who lived through it, of a time when the best-selling car in America was made in a mid-sized Michigan city by the descendants of a blacksmith's son who had believed that the automobile would change the world. He was right. It did. Oldsmobile helped make it happen. And then, quietly, it was gone.